Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Deep Brief, an initiative from the ABU's News Department. We're happy to be organising this edition with the Asia-Europe Institute of University Malaya. Thank you, Dr. Nurliana Kamarudin, Acting Executive Director, and your team for so graciously organising this Deep Brief with us. The idea is to engage the best experts to give deep background on a current affairs topic so journalists and editors get a strong understanding of the subject. Running this session with one of the top universities in the world, we're thrilled to welcome a number of students, researchers and think tank experts to this session as well. Now it's my pleasure to welcome today's expert, Dr. Rahul Mishra, Senior Lecturer at the Asia-Europe Institute, who leads the European Studies Programme and is the Managing Editor of AEI Insights. His topic, the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on Asia. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is centre stage in world news headlines right now, and although it's happening thousands of miles from the Asia-Pacific region, its impact is felt in every country. So we hope this brilliant insight into the conflict through an international relations perspective will give our journalists a better understanding of how global politics works so that your reporting is even more relevant to your audiences at home. For those who couldn't make it and for your colleagues, this forum is being recorded and will be available to everyone on the AsiaVision podcasts and on the AsiaVision website. It's now my pleasure to hand over to the moderator for today, Senior Editor of the ABU News Department, Afru Rashid.
Thank you, Wendy, and I echo the same sentiments and gratitude towards AEI, especially Dr. Liana and our brilliant speaker today, Dr. Rahul Mishra. Now, let me quickly brief you on the rundown for today. We'll have a brief first looking into the various aspects of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and then we'll open up for the Q&As. Now, please note down your questions while the presentation is running, and we'll open up for questions at the end around the 45-minute mark. You may use your hands up button on Zoom, and our Zoom wrangler extraordinaire Shabana Jan will allow your cameras and mics. Or if you prefer, you could write down the questions in the chat box, or you can send it directly to me on chat as well. I trust that as working journalists and researchers, your questions would be very objective, as in any war, all sides will have their sensitivities. So without further delay, Dr. Rahul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rashid, for that introductory comment. And let me begin by thanking the AsiaVision and the organizers, Wendy and Rashid, for this opportunity. I think past more than 1 month has been very challenging and exciting for us, the scholars and students of international relations, the way international politics and the dynamics, strategic and diplomatic dynamics of this region, of the Eurasian Indo-Pacific region has unfolded, has not only posed challenges, but has also been exciting and engaging in a number of ways. And my task today is made rather simple by Rashid, who has posed a bunch of questions before me, and I'm supposed to answer those questions in the next 45 minutes. And that's precisely what I'm going to do. Also, I'll try and cover some more academic aspects, the debates in international relations, because I'm sure all of you as informed citizens of the world community regularly go through the newspaper stories and whatever is happening in the world. So there's no need to discuss and debate that. We'll look at the broad pattern, and we'll also try and see how what this tells us about world politics and what is the likely scenario. As academicians, as journalists, as scholars, does this even tell us something deeper? And that's where I thought the title of these series of dialogues we have looks very apt, the deep brief. So I'll try to meet your expectations in that regard as well. Now, you can see on the screen, the outline is that we'll talk about the impact of Russo-Ukraine conflict on Asia, how it has impacted. Asia is really a mega continent. Dynamics differ from one part of Asia to the other, Southeast Asia to Northeast Asia, Northeast to Middle East or West Asia, if you want, to Indian Ocean region. So Asia is too broad, so I'll focus on perhaps regions that are important in this context, in the Eurasian Indo-Pacific context, regions where both China and Russia have a role to play. The second, is Russia considered a threat to Western powers? Why is Ukraine important to the Western powers? The role of China and India in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. And this is important because both India and China did not vote in favor of the resolution that was proposed at the United Nations Security Council, which made a number of people wonder why Russia is being supported by China and India. Why are China and India on the same page on this question, despite the fact that they've been engaged in a long-standing border dispute and a standoff, military standoff for past 2+ years. Also, India's preferences and priorities differ in the Indo-Pacific region vis-a-vis China. We know about the quadrilateral security dialogue and how India is increasingly shifting towards the US. It is a democracy and abides by the norms of international liberal order. The other important aspect I thought was what is the role of middle and small powers in this conflict? What is their stand? So as the organizers have put it, is Asia taking a neutral stand? And why is it that smaller and middle parts of the region have taken a neutral stand on this? Whether there is any impact of all these sanctions on Russia, the sanctions that have already been slapped on Russia by the European Union members, Europe at large, and also the US. And what is the stand of Quad and the ASEAN in this issue? So these two, as one as an example of the leading mini-lateral forum, the other a regional organization, which is perhaps the second most important in the world if you look at its functionings, its stakes in international politics, and also its approach to conflicts. So this is broadly what I plan to do. Now, the question is, what has happened so far? And where exactly is this Ukraine? So those who are not, not aware of the details of this conflict, so-called conflict or invasion or special military operation, depending on which side you support and where you stand, how do we see it, and where exactly is Ukraine? So if you see the picture, the second one at the bottom, Ukraine gained its independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So not only in geographic terms, but also in cultural, ethnic terms, it is heavily influenced by Russia. And the timeline here would tell you as to how these new countries came into existence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's a very important context. When we look at Ukraine, we have to keep in mind that it is sandwiched between Russia, erstwhile USSR, and the European Union member countries, Europe, if you want to include Moldova as a European country. So sandwiched between Russia, Soviet Union, and Europe, Ukrainian outlook towards security, Ukrainian existence is being massively dominated by these two powers. So if you look at the whole situation from 24th February onwards, or even before 2014 or 2008, 2006, it is very clear that Ukraine really did not have much to offer, much to put on the table. It is a sort of equation between Russia and European Union, Russia and Europe. If you are looking at the NATO as one of the factors, then of course the Western powers, which NATO of course includes the US, and that makes things even more complicated. So in this complicated situation, this is what we have got. As you can see on the screen, the March 24 February, the conflict started, and since then, a number of dialogues have taken place. Countries on both sides have tried to find a peaceful mechanism to resolve the dispute. Russia and Ukraine are already involved in talks that is mediated by Turkey, but that again is just one part of it. European Union has taken a tougher stand, or I think from the state of shock on 24th February and 24, 25th, 26th to a more measured response, to now getting a bit more aggressive on Russian actions. So we are seeing a change in European position. But so far as Russia, Ukraine is concerned, they are also trying to find new ways and mechanisms to resolve the dispute. Of course, this war is not going to be that prolonged. It is from the Russian side, I thought it was a very calculated kind of risk that they took, and it's going to be a short conflict in terms of duration. So this brings me back to the question. So how is the situation unfolding, and what do we know so far? Well, the origin of this conflict, of February 22 conflict, it goes back to at least to February 2014, when the pro-Russia leader, Yanukovych, was replaced by a pro-European leader, and that infuriated the Russians. And since then, a number of developments happened, and they indicate that perhaps Russia is not very happy. Russia was not very happy with the situation. And also the talks between Ukraine and NATO on one side. So there are several prongs to it. One prong is that Ukraine has been in talks with NATO with regards to its membership. That has not materialized for past several years, which didn't serve Ukraine very well. But the other side is this idea that perhaps Ukraine should join European Union. By the way, Ukraine is not even in the list of potential members. So forget the next round, which is going to start by 2025. Then the potential members, which include Serbia and Kosovo. Even beyond that, Ukraine has not been in the list. So we really don't know how these ideas came, who brought in these ideas of Ukraine joining NATO and European Union. NATO perhaps, yes, but not European Union. So in April 2014, Russia invaded Crimea, the next Crimea, a part of Ukraine. That led to a sort of spiraling up of problems. In 2014-15, the Minsk Accord was signed, and the parties were Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany. And in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Europeans thought that the Minsk Accord was dead. Now, with Zelensky being elected as the president of Ukraine, things also got escalated, spiraled up in terms of Russia-Ukraine relationship. So past 2 years, there have been several military exercises between Ukraine and the US, and also Ukraine and European partners, which further aggravated the situation. Tensions escalated, and Russia demanded that a security guarantee from Ukraine that it won't join NATO. So if we look at the broad picture, it seems, sorry about that, it seems that Russia was more or less very fixated with this idea that Ukraine must not join NATO. European Union could be a possibility, a remote one, but certainly no NATO. NATO's eastward expansion was certainly a absolute no for Russia. And all these situations from the Russian side led to what is called as the conflict, invasion, war, special military operations by the Russian side. Now, right now, if you look at the conflict, it is very clear that Ukraine is not in a position to withstand the pressure exerted by the Russian forces. And therefore, they are in absolute need for support. Is this support coming from European Union, from NATO forces? I would say only partially, and it is not sufficient for the Ukrainian forces. If America or the European powers, NATO members were sincere about it, they would have directly participated in this. But that's out of question. Joe Biden has already made that very clear. So NATO is not going to be a direct party in this conflict. That leaves us with a very little window, which is a small scale conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia will try to teach a lesson or basically exert so much of pressure on Ukraine so that it acts as a deterrent for Ukraine, and also punish it for its behavior. And I'm not saying this in common man's language, I'm saying this from IR point of view. Punishing a smaller power is something that great powers keep on doing to make sure that they extract the best gain. So in this given situation, the Russian action, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the second type. The first and the best option would have been Russia extracting this gain, that is Russia compelling Ukraine to not join NATO and European Union, but without using any force. That was forestalled, that was sort of sidelined because of the regime change that happened in 2014. So the second option that Russia had was military intervention, and that's what they've done. This, of course, is the second best option, but I believe, based on the situation so far, that Russia is not going to incur much losses there. Because the direct parties involved here are only these two countries. Mercenaries and those forces sent and supplies sent are very small, too small to make any contribution. They're really very small in terms of their overall role and responsibility. So who started this war? Who started this conflict? And who should we blame for all of this? There are country perspectives. There is Ukrainian perspective, there is Russian perspective, and there is a broader Western perspective. You can look at the EU side. The European perspective is slightly different from the American ones, which looks at the whole Russian-Ukrainian conflict from the great power perspective, from international system perspective. But I'm not going to get into those arguments and counter arguments. This is something that perhaps the journalists should do more, report more. As an academician, I'm going to focus more on contrasting perspectives in international relations debates, in IR debates. Now, how is this perceived? How is this projected in the international media, in IR discourse? It is clearly seen as an attack on the liberal international order. What is international liberal order? In short, liberal international order firmly believes in the inviolability of sovereignty. That post-Treaty of Westphalia, no state can attack the other state. So attacking, invading other countries' territory, no matter what the reason, is completely unacceptable. It poses a challenge, therefore, to the liberal international order, because there is absolutely no excuse for war. And the enormity of this was so powerful that the European countries were in a state of shock. For them, for EU as a peace project, it was a massive blow to this whole concept of European Union, Europe as a continent of peace, a zone of peace, European regional integration as a project as a peace project. So it has certainly made a dent on that. European Union or European region is no longer a zone of peace, that is for sure, at least in geographic terms. Thankfully, EU is not involved, so we can say that European Union is still safe. But it has led to a massive dent in the founding principles of liberal international order, the way it is perceived. And this is I thought, a genuine concern from the European side, that liberal international order has been attacked, and it demands that European powers and also the US take necessary steps, which they have not taken. Corrective steps have not been taken. The other accusation, which makes a lot of sense from my point of view, is that revisionist tendencies, the hegemonic tendencies of Russia are very much evident in this region. And perhaps this attack on Ukraine is driven by this idea that post-Soviet state should be under the control of Russia. There's no problem with being a hegemon, being a revisionist. This is what great powers do, especially those that are trying to get back to the center stage, such as Russia. I thought the last accusation was even more powerful, in the sense that European Union believes, the West, let's say, believes that Russia is still not out of Cold War mentality, that they look at NATO expansion and European Union expansion from a zero-sum game point of view. This applies, by the way, to the European Union as well, to the US as well. NATO's expansion, and so these rounds of expansion and NATO's overall policies after the end of the Cold War certainly don't make sense if you look at it from a rationalist perspective on security. So all in all, I think it has come as a threat to the EU peace project, and how European Union deals with this situation will determine the shape of this regional organization and also Europe as such. Whether Russia is dealt with only in terms of dialogue and negotiations, or you're going to see a Cold War 2.0 in the European continent between Europe and Russia, or it is going to escalate further and lead to a systemic Cold War, is something that is worth our wait and observation. Now, within the IR discourse, one major development that has taken place is John Mearsheimer, an American professor and leading, perhaps the most important scholar on realist scholar who specializes in offensive realism, has critiqued America's policy, has critiqued NATO's policy and European Union's role, saying that it's the West which is responsible for the Ukrainian crisis and not Russia. And but this is something that it's not a recent thing. He has been saying this for a number of years. It's just that his arguments have come to the fore only recently, just the beginning of this month. Now, this again is not an anti-US statement, as some in the Chinese media and Russian media have tried to project. This is part of an open, intellectual, inclusive debate. And I must say that had Mearsheimer not been an American, these things would not have been accepted in any other country. So it is the beauty of the American intellectual circle that even such strong adversarial views that are against the American and the government and the NATO as an organization are also accepted, debated. Now, Mearsheimer's points are, if you look at the major statements that have come out, is one interview that he gave to a journalist from New Yorker. The article was later on published in The Economist also, where the fundamental idea, Mearsheimer's primary idea, is that all of this started with the first and second rounds of expansion of NATO. So starting from 1999, Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic were the countries that were the first one to get on board in a post-Cold War NATO expansion. Then you had Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, and Croatia. Now, Mishra says that these first two rounds of expansion were accepted by Russia, but they were not ready for the third one. So things started changing in 2006 when it was proposed by NATO that Ukraine would also join NATO, Ukraine and Georgia. Russian experts and Russian foreign policy makers at that time, the policy circle, had made it very clear that they are not going to tolerate any such activity. And in 2008, when Georgia was attacked, Russia made its intentions very clear. Things unfolded further, and we went to 2014, where the Crimean annexation happened, and even though NATO did not induct Ukraine in its as a part of NATO team, or European Union expansion did not happen to include Ukraine, European powers and the US, they did support Ukraine on military front and also on economic front. So as a trade agreement was signed and military supplies were provided to Ukraine, especially in 2019 and 2021. During Trump's time, the number of supplies also increased, and that led to further stress between Russia and Ukraine, and this certainly spooked the Russians. Now, if we were to look at the current conflict and how it unfolded from realist and constructivist explanations, what does this tell us? It is very clear that if you are a realist and look at it, the whole situation from a realist point of view, it's very clear that it's a classic case of security dilemma. Security of one party in a conflict or in an adversarial relation is security of one party in a conflict. As it increases, it leads to concerns and anxieties on the other side. So it's a zero-sum game. In this case, as Ukraine and the West try to strengthen Ukraine's security overall, the Western security vis-a-vis Russia, that spooked the Russians, that made Russians insecure and led to the security dilemma and leading to the conflict. But then Mishra has his own problems. Mishra, being an offensive realist, has been saying that a state has to maximize its security and military capability to such an extent that the adversary is not even in a position to stand up and say yes to a conflict, say yes to a fight. So from the offensive realism point of view, it is very clear that what NATO did was European Union, what European Union tried to do, what the US has been doing all this while makes a lot of sense. You have to make sure that your country that is not at good terms with you and is a challenge to the regional international order that you're proposing, you have to expand it. But the problem was, Mishra thinks that the problem was that Ukraine was not provided with enough security apparatus, and it led to a substantial change in Russian approach. Russia thought that it was still alienated, that it was still not accepted as a part of the Western system, despite the Euro-Atlantic approaches of Boris Yeltsin and his successors. So early 90s, and even Putin during his first term were very pro-US. They made all those structural adjustment programs and economic reforms, tried to align closely with the West, thinking that the Cold War has ended. None of that yielded any positive results, and that made Russians feel that they are not part of they'll never be accepted as a part of the Western system. So the security dilemma and differing perceptions led to this conflict is what realists would argue. How would constructivists view this situation? Alexander Wendt would in his classical style and his traditional, going by his traditional statement, would say anarchy is what states make of it. And in this case, it is very clear that even though there were no security anxieties on either parts, the way NATO expansion happened and the way Russia responded to it led to this, this conflict situation, which, if not checked now, can further escalate. But I think Jennifer Midzin, a scholar, again, an American scholar based in America, is, her points I thought were more appealing, that states, in this case Ukraine, has been seeking ontological security rather than going for rationalist security. Ontological security means that you are so obsessed about self and self-conception of security that you put your physical security at peril. So security in your head drives your security approaches on the ground, leading to this conflict. So we see that in case of Ukraine, trying to join NATO, trying to join European Union without any substantive steps taken on the ground led to this situation. This is a theoretical discourse, and I'm not, or none of these scholars are blaming Ukraine for what has happened, or Russia for that matter. But from the constructivist point of view, ontological security seeking is a problematic idea. If you put it in practice, it leads to jeopardizing physical security, it states physical security. Other than this, what are possible explanations? Why is Russia so anxious, and why is Russia so upset with NATO's eastward expansion? Russia, all of us know, is a wounded power. The way Soviet Union collapsed and the way it was not accepted, accommodated in the international system is something that is reflected in the statements, in the policies, in the discourses on Russian foreign policy. So honor, fear, and alienation are also possible explanation, and all of these are part of the constructivist approach to international relations, the constructivist explanation to international relations, and especially regional orders, states' behavior. Now, in this context, in the theoretical context, and with all these developments that have taken place, I'll try and quickly answer the questions that were posed. So the first question that Russia had asked, is Russia a threat to the West? No. A short answer is no. And especially till 2014, that was not the case. Russia was only trying to align with the US, with the Western world. It was trying to get closer to Europe, especially after the during Boris Yeltsin time and after the launch of Euro-Atlantic policy. So Russia's double-headed eagle started looking towards Europe, and that failed. And then came Primakov with his Asianist approach, engagement with Asia. And of course, that led to a number of steps from by the Russian side, from joining APEC to engaging ASEAN through dialogue mechanisms, etc. But Russia was never seen as a threat. I mean, 9/11, one of the first countries that supported America and condemned the terrorist attack on the US was Russia. And Putin was more than willing to support America in its fight against terror. So till 2014, things were relatively okay. Yes, Russia felt marginalized with NATO and EU expansions. Perhaps at that time, drawing a lesson from the ASEAN experience, EU should have engaged Russia in a dialogue mechanism, maybe negotiating a deal to, if not make Russia a member of European Union, at least make a dialogue partner or establish some mechanisms. Majority of mechanisms that exist between Russia and Europe are led by Germany, the leading powers, Germany and France, which of course have very good relations with Russia. The Russian equation with Europe and European Union has been dominated by the American presence, the American agenda, and that in a way has affected this relationship. Even today, if Russia and European Union were to deal with their issues bilaterally, things would get different. Things would be different. beyond 2014, with Putin coming back to power, things started changing, and Russia's adventures in its neighborhood, Georgia, Ukraine, Crimea, led to this belief that perhaps Russia is an outlier, is a revisionist state, is a threat to liberal international order. But we really cannot substantiate this. There is a cause-effect anomaly here, and the centrality of security dilemma is the only explanatory tool, meaning that we don't know Russia was considered a threat, or because we sidelined, we marginalized, we alienated Russia so much that it turned into a challenge. And we can draw comparisons with ASEAN, and I'll do that later. Security dilemma certainly explains a number of policies. The Euro-Atlantic policies, if Europe had accepted, appreciated those approaches, perhaps that would have helped us in making Russia a part of a more inclusive liberal international order, which it is not. Now, how is Ukraine seen in the West? Don't go by what is written in newspapers and media and Twitter and what have you, especially nothing that is written in 2022. If you look at the facts and just the facts, for the West, for European Union, Ukraine has never been a top priority, is not in the priority list, is not the top priority. That's very clear, because EU as a regional organization is very legalistic. It is very, you have to deliver first and then ask for returns, right? So in case of European Union, it is very clear that Ukraine is not a possibility. Ukraine is not a potential partner. In case of NATO, yes, it is a possibility, but that has been delayed. And we really don't know why. Whether NATO made a thorough assessment and realized that perhaps the cost of integrating Ukraine is higher than the benefits, than the perceived benefits, potential benefits, and perhaps that's why Ukraine was just, supported informally and only as another country, not a member of this collective security mechanism. We see evidences of buck passing here, and buck passing would mean that arming Ukraine was driven clearly by this idea that maybe Ukraine should be strong enough to fight and balance Russia, and we shouldn't get our hands dirty in this. So buck passing explains why America and Europe, NATO members, did not directly involve themselves in supporting integrating Ukraine. So what is Ukraine's core utility? It's a transit route for gas supplies, and it's a next door neighbor for Russia. And therefore, it can act as a buffer state if you make it a democratic country based on liberal principles. It can act as a buffer state. If not, Russia will try to make it a buffer state, and that's exactly what has been happening. Before 2014, you saw that there was a pro-Russia leader. After the color revolution, after the regime change, we saw a pro-America leader taking over. So it is very clearly a pawn in this politics, in this balance of power politics. Ukraine, in terms of EU expansion, is difficult. It is going to be, I think, only a remote possibility, not in the next 10 years. But yes, crisis can be a trigger, as a number of scholars have argued earlier, that in case of European regional integration, crisis acts as a motivating factor. So if Ukraine has a chance to join NATO or European Union, that the moment is now, within next, I think, 2 to 6 months, is the possibility. I'm not sure about later. Now, if you look at, so this basically map tells you as to who are these countries, the current members, the official candidates that are recognized as potential candidates, and Ukraine in yellow is not in that list. And this is as of February 2020. This is basically details on EU's expansion agenda, official EU candidates, which are to be included by 2025 include Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Turkey. Potential EU candidates, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. Countries that aren't the EU members or candidates or potential candidates include Russia and Ukraine both, because they fall in that immediate neighborhood. And therefore, and there are other countries like Switzerland, you have Vatican City in Monaco, Liechtenstein. It doesn't make much difference for these countries. So if you look at countries that have the potential to become EU members, or that should be included in EU's next 3 rounds of expansion, include both Russia and Ukraine. We don't know. International politics is all about possibilities. Now, how do we look at the Asian powers, the role of China and India in this? Very intriguing, very surprising for many, but both India and China have different and compelling reasons to support Russia. For China, relations with Russia are based on this axis of convenience. It's a marriage of convenience. It's certainly driven by this idea that both Russia and China are not seen as countries that comply with the liberal international order, or countries that see their goals and agenda aligned with contemporary liberal international order. Given an opportunity, they will like to change it, tweak it, sideline it based on their requirements. And therefore, a lot of speculative writings have been produced over the past few months on this China-Russia relationship. Of course, there are some who look at it as a potential buck-passing episode from the American point of view. That is, China and Russia can balance each other, and therefore there is no challenge to, no threat to the liberal international order. But that is a remote possibility. With these flurry of visits by the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, who's apparently in India today, and so is the British Foreign Minister, it tells us that Russia is lobbying for support in countries across Asia. And it is, to a certain extent, been successful in doing that. Compare the price of ruble on 24th, 25th, end of February with what it is now. Ruble is bouncing back, even though Biden had said that ruble is getting dusted to rubbles, is not true. Russia is trying to find ways to stabilize its economy, to stabilize its currency, and also find alternative routes, which poses a massive challenge to America. I mean, despite all these rhetorics, Biden administration has not done much on the ground. It's the European countries which are primarily involved in supporting Ukraine, or trying to gather more support for Ukraine. So it is very clear that Russia is looking for these weaker spots in terms of finding new mechanisms. And there have been agreements and negotiations for agreements whereby the currency for trade would be ruble instead of the US dollar. And that is a likely possibility with China, with a number of European countries as well, with the countries in Southeast and South Asia. Russia is exploring possibilities. So it is also trying to find a mechanism. Also, China and Russia's opinion, their perspectives on Indo-Pacific are more or less the same, and that makes them get more closer. So they have a similar opinion on Quad, they have a similar opinion on Indo-Pacific, and both these countries think that America is trying to perpetuate the liberal international order and also its hegemony in these parts of the world. And that makes sense. Also, from Chinese perspective, a weaker Russia is not in China's interest. A weaker Russia is in China's interest, not a fallen Russia. And that's a typical standard balance of logic. And this again goes, the The balance of power logic has been one of the driving fundamentals, driving principles of American foreign policy. Biden has been trying to sideline that as well, which is going to be a disaster. I'll come to that later. So far as India is concerned, India's insistence on strategic autonomy, the logic of multi-alignment, China as the principal source of threat, the existential threat to Indian security, and also India's defense supplies and defense considerations make Russia an important partner. And that's why India has made it clear a number of times in different platforms that it is not going to compromise on those issues. So even with Quad members, the 3 Quad members, that is the US, Japan, and Australia, India has made it very clear that for India, the existential security threat is China, and Russia is only contributing in mitigating that threat. So therefore, it's out of question to make a statement or go against Russia. And the other Asian powers, Japan and Australia, has been appreciative of that. Perhaps it will take some more time for the global hegemon to understand that not all countries will abide by the terms dictated by the US administration. Safety of Indian expats is another very pressing concern, has been a pressing concern for India. And based on number of evacuations and the engagements that have taken place in rescuing citizens from other countries is something that we should keep in mind in looking at India's approach. Of course, for India, this is a different theater of conflict, and that also makes things different. India is not a superpower. India is just it's an Indo-Pacific power which has more stakes in South Asia and neighboring areas, Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Central Asia, but not much beyond that. So that also plays a role. Also, for Indian policymakers, it's also an important question to see how and in what ways European Union and Europe as such contributes to Indo-Pacific security, and whether those equations between Russia and Europe impact the Indo-Pacific security. And the answer is that such an impact is only minimal. And this also drives India's security calculations. And this is just a sort of graph to tell you the number of Indians that are, the foreign students and Indians who are based in Ukraine. And as you can see here, India's stakes are highest. In terms of arms supplies, as you can see here, majority of India's arms supplies, defense supplies come from Russia, and therefore it makes it very difficult for India to overlook the Russia factor in its security capabilities, building its security capabilities. Now, another important question is, why is why is ASEAN so neutral on this? So ASEAN is so quiet on this, except perhaps Singapore and Philippines. In the wider Indo-Pacific region, Japan and Korea, not many countries have come out against, giving statements against Russia. And this is driven by the idea of non-interference. It is the non-interference tradition that shapes ASEAN's approach. Malaysia is one of these countries. And Malaysia's approach is clearly driven by that idea that we are not going to interfere in what is happening in Russia-Ukraine conflict, because we don't interfere. Second, even though we do not want to interfere, we are open to this idea that a peaceful negotiation should be started, and security should be achieved through dialogue. For small powers and middle powers in the Indo-Pacific region, in wider Asia, Cold War is the best template. It's a functioning template, and since the stakes are not very high for ASEAN countries, I mean, they are not directly involved. Ukraine is not one of the biggest partners, nor is Russia. So this ad hoc approach and Cold War template is serving ASEAN countries very well, and India is not out of this template. I mean, India also believes in this kind of template. So as long as the international system is making this transition. We don't know whether it is going to be a Cold War 2.0, but for this transition phase, for small powers and middle powers, ad hoc approach is the best option. And that's why ASEAN countries have taken a rhetorical stand rather than anything else. The China factor is also important. And at least some in ASEAN region and wider Asian region believe that if you are hawkish on Russia, if you are so critical of Russia that you make such statements that countries such as Singapore have come up with or Korea have come up with, you'll unnecessarily polarize the system. You'll unnecessarily bring Russia and China closer, which is not a good thing. You'll unnecessarily create this atmosphere where we have no option but to take ideological stands. Democracy versus a non-democracy, or countries that support LIO, liberal international order, or countries that are revisionist. So this polarization is something that creates a lot of anxiety. This is one of the core sources of small power anxieties, and that's why the neutrality. Of course, the Eurasian region, Russia, Ukraine, is a theater far away, and that also tells us why the situation is so different. Now, very quickly, the standpoint of ASEAN and Quad. For Quad countries, 3 Quad members, Australia, Japan, and the US have opposed Russia. India is not, and therefore there's no consensus, and Quad has not come up with any statement. So this makes polarization difficult. Quad has been seen as a minilateral platform which might work as a security provider in the Indo-Pacific region. And Quad not coming up with a statement on Russia-Ukraine conflict tells us a lot about the fluidity in international system, about the capacity shortfall. I don't know if you can call it capacity shortfall, but certainly intentional shortfall. Roles that America should perform and has not performed. And this could perhaps be a counter question to the great John Mearsheimer, who believes in power maximization, and yet we see this gap in American policies and practices. India's neutral stand on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is perhaps another template for smaller countries, for smaller middle powers in the region. Japan-India and Japan-Australia summit, it's seen that even though Japan and Australia are critical of Russia's actions, war, of course, cannot be accepted. It is really totally unacceptable the way Russia invaded Ukraine. War is not something that a civilized world should accept and will never accept. But there are concerns, and these concerns from the Russian side, from the European side, from other partners such as India are also given due consideration by other Asian powers, and that gives acts as a moderating agent in softening the American hegemonic behavior in the region, or even at the international level. So there are problems, there are shortfalls in America's role as the sole superpower. It is no longer a unipolar system. It's not no longer a unipolar moment for America. It is certainly a multipolar world, a multiplex world rather, if you use Professor Amita Acharya's terms. And this explains beautifully because concerns in the Eurasian region are totally different from concerns in the Indo-Pacific region. Priorities are different. Role of actors is different. So India's role in Indo-Pacific is different as compared to Eurasia. Or European Union's role in the Eurasian region, in the European continent, is so vastly different from what it is in the Indo-Pacific region. In Indo-Pacific, we see only the leading powers, France, Germany, and Netherlands, coming up with their Indo-Pacific approaches or trying to play a more proactive role. European Union as a regional organization certainly has a lot to contribute, and it is doing that. But other individual countries, those rest of those countries, 24 countries, their positions vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific is again driven, motivated, shaped, constrained by this by the logic of geography. So theaters do play a role. And that tells us why the international system is so complicated. It is so, it looks so confusing at times, that even on questions related to war, we don't see countries across the world or democracies or countries that are part of the Western system, countries that benefit from Western system, or non-aligned neutral countries, why and how they don't support the West on such issues. And that is very much evident here. You can see that there are 5 countries against the resolution. 38 countries were 38 countries abstained, including Vietnam, right? So Vietnam and Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan and Laopedia, Iran, Indonesia, very important countries in South, Southeast, and Central Asia and the Persian Gulf. Finally, is Europe or the West ready for a war with Russia? Of course, we understand that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is a massive challenge to the European norms and rules and principles. It is certainly an attack on liberal values that the EU propounds, EU believes in, and EU is run by those norms and values. So the question whether Europe or the West, that includes the US, is ready for a war, or what is the West going to do in dealing with this crisis, the answer is still no. There is no chain ganging happening. That means one for all for one kind of mechanism is not there. It is still a very remote possibility that an attack on any of the countries that are outside of European Union, outside of NATO, attack on them are considered an attack on NATO forces, on the West as it is defined. No, that's not happening. And because chain ganging is not happening, there's no war, even as a remote possibility. So Russia and the West are going to drag along this zero-sum game and feeling that they are each other's adversaries. Because of lack of alliances outside of the NATO zone, outside of the Eurozone, this gives us a bit of window. I mean, we can certainly feel comfortable that war is not around the corners. Buck passing behavior is certainly something that dominates, that defines the Western approach towards the US, whether it is Russia-Ukraine crisis or looking at Russia-China equation. Buck passing is something that the West and the US has been hoping for. They've been trying for it, but it has led to adverse outcomes in both the cases. And this perhaps explains why no attempt should be made to bring China and Russia closer. I'm talking about it from the Western perspective. Also, the ASEAN countries understand it pretty well, and that's why they are not making any wrong moves. They are not trying to give any wrong signals to China or to Russia, because they know that either way it is going to impact their own security. Now, I thought in this conflict, the most worrisome step or misstep or a mistake is Biden's repetitive statements on regime change. They are irresponsible statements and dangerous beyond imagination, is something I would say in my assessment of America's approach. Maybe this is Biden's usual slip of tongue moment. These, he at times he says things that he doesn't mean to, and perhaps that's what happened. But a regime change in Russia is a recipe for disaster. It would be suicidal for the Western world, for the liberal international order, for the American hegemony, because that again will be an existential threat, perceived existential threat to Russia. And I'm sure policymakers in Beijing are taking down notes on what is happening in Russia and Ukraine, how the international system is dealing with it, how major, middle, and small powers are dealing with it. And these messages are not going down very well in China also. And that is the most worrisome case. China is far more powerful in terms of taking these preemptive measures to avoid any regime change. And China, unlike Russia, is run by a single party. It's a communist country which has always been questioned on its mode of governance, its style of governance by the Western world. And therefore, these statements might escalate the situation, might lead to the beginning of the Cold War 2.0. And if that happens, the first casualty would be the liberal international order, as it is happening now in the European Union, in the European region. I'll stop there and welcome questions and comments. I know I have overstepped the allocated time, but I still hope there's time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul. It has certainly given us journalists a great insight into the motivations of politicians, and of course certainly help us to greatly predict future outcomes in terms of foreign policy considerations of the Asian powers. Thank you also to the participants for your lively discussions, especially Sam from Macau, who's led the discussions. Let me quickly get into the questions very quickly, and I'll try to limit it to 20 minutes maximum. We've a question from Daniel from University in Germany, who says, what about an identity-based approach? Would you agree that the Ukrainian crisis is a result of unclear Ukrainian identity, resulting in a different external attitude towards Ukraine?
Yes, certainly identity is an important factor. If you look at this whole situation from a constructivist point of view, identity is certainly a factor. And that's why I think I did mention that Ukraine is seen as a buffer state by both Russia and Europe. So Europe wants to assimilate Ukraine in the Western liberal, democratic, open, inclusive society, a representative of that kind of system, so that it puts more pressure on Russia. Whereas Russia, based on its ethnic considerations and the Russian-speaking people, territorial questions, it uses that fluid identity to its advantage, and that has certainly made a mess out of Ukrainian situation. So yes, I do agree with this point.
We also have a question from David Ingram, who says, it's a media question. Putting aside the causes and rights and wrongs of the conflict, an asymmetric war is also being conducted on global media. One country is open to media for both domestic and open audiences, while the other is closed foreign media and reporting is restricted to its own people. What are the implications of this and for the combat nations themselves and the likely outcome for victory?
Sorry, I lost the last part.
What are the implications of this for the combat nations, Russia and Ukraine, and the outcome of this, or the likelihood of their victory?
Well, this question is related more to the way media is perceived, open societies versus closed societies. So it's difficult to answer. I mean, open societies are certainly, for them, it's far more easier, like the US at this moment with Mersheimer, putting up such a massive critique of American approach. This certainly poses a lot of challenge. But this is the beauty of open societies. This being open to contrasting ideas makes American democracy so beautiful. And I don't think this has to do anything with the chances to emerge victorious in a given situation. You see, state behavior is different from, state behavior in international politics is different from state behavior within. I mean, there are, those closed societies like Russia, if you want to take names, or China, But how China and Russia behave in the international system is a completely different thing. I mean, their military capability, unless there is, unless there are these massive people protest against the government, nothing's going to change. And even those protests against their respective governments is because of domestic concerns. So we've got to separate these two aspects. If you're looking at winnability in a war, winnability in a conflict, you have to separate domestic from foreign policy dimensions. A country collapses because of its domestic constraints, because of its domestic conflicts, because of its domestic things that get messed up. In terms of foreign policy, close countries that are closed systems and open systems don't really make much of a difference. It is about your military preparedness and nothing else.
We also have another, I'll combine two questions. One is that how do you see the world order after this conflict? And can this conflict be a motivation for more integration or involvement of China and Russia in the liberal order?
Okay, so first is impact of this on international system.
Yep.
And second is
would this be a motivation for integrating China and Russia into the liberal order?
All right. So, okay. So the implication, I think it is very clear. The outcome of this conflict will shape America and Europe's behavior, will shape the liberal international order. How? So your potential partners, in a difficult territory, China's neighboring countries, China's neighborhood or Russia's neighborhood, Europe and the US to a certain extent are going to be far more careful, but far more systematic in engaging these neighboring countries. So next time you have Print 2.0, I think Europe will be much more disciplined, much more coordinated in its approach, and certainly much more sincere. I think looking at it from European point of view, I think they also never expected it. It came as a shock, but all this while they thought Americans are going to do something about it, and they didn't do anything. So for Europeans, it's certainly a point of disappointment. And that goes again back to Macron's point. NATO is dead. NATO is brain dead, and European Union should come up with its own security apparatus. I mean, what else is more powerful, more substantial than a conflict in your immediate neighborhood? And you are relying upon the US, Biden, and NATO. I mean, this certainly should be seen as an existential challenge, not a threat, challenge to European security architecture, security apparatus. The second question was whether China and Russia will be included in the international system. I don't think Russia or China will be included in the system. What it is going to do is it's going to be seen as a point of catharsis. This will either lead to a further refinement in the international system, a more structured and disciplined liberal international order, which has all these very set parameters as to what is acceptable, what is not, and to what is your threshold. Or if the stakeholders are not able to refine the liberal international order, then I'm sorry, we have to bid farewell to LIO, and what will remain is only liberal regional order, not the international order, unfortunately. So meaning that it will lead to Cold War 2.0.
The next question is from Wan Zainuddin. How far would NATO and the allies extend sanctions on Russia beyond the current conflict? The UK mentioned that it will only lift sanctions once Russia guarantees no future violence, but this is vague and unlikely for Russia to commit to. So how do you predict the sanctions in the future?
Okay, sanctions are a good tool. I missed that sanctions part, but that was deliberate because sanctions are not going to stand for long. This is driven by two points. First, the European energy supplies are massively dependent on Russia, and Europe at this moment even in the midst of crisis, is trying to find alternative routes. The American supplies, energy supplies, are far more, they are costlier and they are far more complicated than Nord Stream and other sources of energy supply from Russia. Middle East, again, is a remote possibility. It's certainly not that feasible. It is not that attractive an option. So I think at one point, these energy engagements, these sanctions are going to be lifted. What are these terms and conditions is something that is worth our wait. But Europe cannot really make it without Russia. And the same applies to Russia as well. For Russia, I mean, we know that for Russia, invading Ukraine would have been the last resort, because Russia has faced this, Soviet Union has faced this in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Countries in the East Europe and their protests, so Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, history is full of all those conflicts. So as Mersheimer puts it, occupying new territory for a far less inferior Russia compared to Soviet Union is like swallowing a porcupine. Why would Russia do that? And Putin is not up for, recreating a Soviet Union or a greater Russia. So this certainly is a very costly affair for Russia as well, as we are seeing the kind of amount of sanctions that are imposed and the difficulties it is going to create. So for both the parties, in short, for both the parties, lifting sanctions and finding other routes is the way out. How soon they settle down their, they sit across table and negotiate again is would be interesting to watch.
We have another question from Sufi Hairul Bahri, who asks, does the Ukraine-Russia conflict show the inability of the United Nations in preventing conflict? And as a follow-up, does the conflict reinforce the limitations of liberal international organizations and cooperation from a realist point of view?
Okay, from all perspectives, liberal, realist, constructivist, feminist, the United Nations is a failure. United Nations was created to deal with the problem, theoretically speaking, to deal with the problem of anarchy, which is the most important concern, the most critical concern for both liberals and realists. Has UN been able to do it? No. In the past 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, I don't know when was the last time when the United Nations did something worth its name. So, and Security Council is always in a deadlock mode. So no matter what the situation is, you have a Security Council which always faces this deadlock because of the veto system. So United Nations has certainly failed all of us. There is no doubt about it. Theoretically, this is because they have not been able to find a solution to overcome the problem of anarchy. You see this in Europe, in the European Union region. They have done it beautifully. I mean, past 50 years, neighborhood aside, Ukraine aside, within the European Union, there's been no conflict. And that's a great success. That's what makes European Union so different. And that's why they have a point in, being shocked at this Russia-Ukraine conflict, that this is something that European Union as a peace project had never imagined. I mean, this is so uncivilized, if you use their terminology. This is so uncivilized to get into a violent conflict and make people suffer.
Collins has a question. Collins, can I put you up on spotlight? It's a bit long for me to ask. In the meantime, Olga asks about what do you think about the Nazi ideology spread in Ukraine?
Okay. Well, Nazi ideology in Ukraine, it's a domestic factor. All countries, whether it is the US or countries in the European Union, the rise of populism in European Union, Hungary is one example, or evidences of this in France and Poland, is certainly a problem. But that should not determine, unless it becomes a systemic challenge, that should not determine a country A's invasion of country B, or country A's, dissatisfaction to such an extent that combatants are involved in killing non-combatants. That is, a war situation is not a justification. Nazi ideology is certainly on the rise, but that's just a domestic factor. There are stronger, more appealing reasons for Ukraine and Russia to get into this by choice or by compulsion.
All right, Collins, the floor is yours.
Hi, Doctor.
Hello.
Great to see you here. So my question will be on the a lot of arguments have been put forth on Kremlin's moves to have this kind of strategic patience in its dealing with the West since the 2014 invasion, as well as the regime change in Ukraine. So and with various warnings by Putin and the Kremlin, in giving messages to the West that, of course, they can't tolerate this, but of course, culminating in this conflict in Ukraine now, that do you see this as a largely a Putin's effect, or a larger systemic inevitable entrapment of the Thucydides trap that they will be destined for war, irrespective of whoever is in charge of the Kremlin? And your point earlier on Mearsheimer's long-held argument that all this started in 2008, where during the NATO meeting it was stated that Ukraine and Georgia will be admitted, and since then I think he has been proven right in a lot of occasions. So do you concur with his arguments on this largely?
Okay, let me start with Mearsheimer's point. Yes, Mearsheimer, his explanation and his warnings make a lot of sense. But Mearsheimer is not the only one. Of course, he's adored by the realists and IA scholars, but there have been dozens, if not hundreds of scholars, Russian scholars and Russia experts who've been saying this. For instance, a doctoral student of mine whose thesis was on Russia as a great power and Russia's approach towards the West, Russia's great powerness as a factor. So the failure on part of Europe, the West, to engage Russia is a major factor. The fact that Russia was not made a part of the broader Western system post-Cold War has led us to this situation. So Euro-Atlanticism, or when Russia was openly embracing the Western world, that was our moment. We failed Russia. We failed. Boris Yeltsin was, of course, there yet number of problems, but his overtures, or Putin 1.0, his willingness to engage the US was not rewarded, was not appreciated. That led Russia to again, strongly believe that they are not going to be a part of the Western system. So what do they have? What have they got? All they've got is make sure that their security is made absolute, is impenetrable. And that has led to this situation. Now, so far as strategic patience is concerned, it didn't start with 2014. It started with NATO's eastward expansion. At that time, there were, even within the European region, there were countries that said, oh, NATO is no longer relevant. Why don't we just abandon it? But NATO was enhanced, expanded, and re-strengthened. New charter and new roles and responsibilities was primarily the American agenda. Europeans were really very honest people. They believed in the US designs. America as a hegemonic power, it had its own intentions. It always had its own designs. So America wanted to sustain the unipolar moment using NATO. And who paid the price? European Union. That's the price. NATO expansion was the American design. And same Mearsheimer would use the same argument. He'd say, maximize your power and capabilities. So maximize NATO. That's what he said, right? In Tragedy of World Power Politics. The same argument. Now, who's paying the price? It's Europe which is paying the price. And European leaders should have been, should have paid attention to this, because Russia is in their immediate neighborhood. right? So logic of geography, they overlooked the logic of geography. And they overlooked it on two parts. One, they thought that norms and rules, a new system, that we are so advanced and modern now that war is not a possibility, even with Russia. That was first myth that is busted. And second, that NATO is for all of us is also is a myth that is busted now. Look at America's role at this moment. I mean, they simply exploited. I'm being very provocative here. But they exploited NATO to their advantage, and today it is not serving their interests, and that's why they're saying, "Oh, NATO doesn't have to get involved. I'm not going to get involved in the war up there," and so it's primarily the European responsibility. That makes Macron such a brilliant statesman when he said things about NATO and tried to separate NATO security ideas from European security ideas. It is Europe's responsibility now. I mean, you have to deal with it. America's not going to do any favors to you.
I think that's a good point for the next question. Do you believe that Russia has played a role in promoting the rise of populism and right-wing politics in the US and EU?
Well, Russia, if you tell this to Russians, they I don't know what is their highest honor. But isn't this interesting? If Russia can play such a role in the rise of populism and right-wing politics in the US and the EU, then the logical extension is to this argument is that Russia is more powerful than the US and EU. It can engineer regime changes in these countries. So that's a far-fetched one. Russia is not responsible for the rise of populism. And populism, anyway, rises in a country for its own domestic reasons. Rise of populism or rise of Trump in the US has nothing to do with what was happening in the world. It was America's own problems. Rise of growth, lack of economic growth, rise in unemployment, frustration of common Americans with the economic policies of the government, and so on and so forth. Rise of populism in Hungary has nothing to do with Russia or the US, right? Yes, it influences, it looks as a bad example. A rise of populism in one country is seen as an example and as an inspiration for rogue elements within the society of other countries, but only to that extent. So neo-Nazis in parts of Europe, yes, they influence each other and shape each other, but that's it. That's about it. Nothing beyond that.
All right. Thank you all for all the questions. We have run out of our allocated time, but just to wrap up things, one last question from Ashok Bihari. What are the perspectives of an abatement to the conflict, and what could possibly trigger a resolution, if not a solution?
Revolution? Sorry.
A solution. What are the perspectives of an abatement of the conflict, and what could possibly trigger a resolution, or if not a solution?
Okay, perspectives of abatement of conflict and resolution is, first is there is a lot at stake for both Russia and European Union. As the time passes, as the war conflict drags on, the time passes by, both Russia and European Union will realize that they are the ones who are losing the most out of it. Ukraine never had anything to achieve out of it. I mean, it's sandwiched between superpowers, right? Plus you have a superpower which is interested in doing simulation exercise on how to how to drop a nuclear bomb on Russia, but it's not there on the ground, So the situation is really tricky. You have on the other side a country like Turkey, which is a part of NATO but not European Union. So unfulfilled promises make Ukrainian situation difficult. I mean, they don't have much role to play there. Now, how is Russia and European Union going to look at it? It is very clear that is, as this conflict drags on, it will compel these two parties to sit across the table and find solutions. And if America is not smart enough, America is going to lose in this. That the long view is that if Americans don't show enough interest in resolving this crisis or standing with the Europeans, with the European Union, they would suffer in the long run. Because Europe and Russia are going to find a solution sooner or later. It's in their interest. They don't want to perpetuate this conflict. Ukraine doesn't have enough to withstand these military attacks. And same applies to Russia. I mean, Russia can sustain it for 6 months, maybe 6 years. Ukraine is doing it for 6 weeks, not beyond that. So there is, of course, this possibility that negotiations will take place. I think, well, I'm not sure, but I think that this is a good lesson for policymakers in Europe to do a good cost-benefit analysis, see what is in their best interest. I mean, they cannot be, a rather informal, offensive word, but they cannot be side shows to American hegemonic behavior in the international system. They have to see their security concerns as their primary responsibility. And that will bring them to the table, that will make them talk to Russians, and Russians will, of course, be keen to do it. The US position on this is something worth our attention, worth our weight.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Rahul. I hope that was good enough content for all journalists to work on for the next month also. Thank you to all the questions and to all who participated in the discussions. We'll have the next edition of the debrief at the end of next month, and we'll be looking into reporting on cryptocurrencies and blockchain.